Hi 3CM, ready for chapter 4? So the rescuers are going to go through the Gump, aren't they, to rescue Raymond Trottle, who's the prince. And we've got Cornelius the wizard, Gherkintrud the fae, Hans the ogre, and possibly Odge Gribble the hag. But we're not sure if she's persuaded the king and queen yet. We'll have to find out. Are you ready? So chapter 4. Well, this is it, said Ernie Hobbs, floating past the boarded up left luggage office and coming to a rest on an old mailbag. This is the day. He was a thin ghost with a drooping moustache, still dressed in the railway porter's uniform he'd worn when he worked in the station. Ernie hated the newfangled luggage trolleys, taking the bread out of the mouths of honest men who used to carry people's suitcases. He also had a sorrow because after he'd died, his wife had married again. And when he went to haunt his old house, Ernie could see a man called Albert Fishing sitting in Ernie's old chair with a napkin tied around his nasty neck, eating the bangers and mash that Ernie's wife had cooked for him. All the same, Ernie was a hero. It was he who had seen Mrs. Trottle snatch the baby prince outside the fish shop and try to glide after the Rolls Royce and stop her. And when that hadn't worked, he'd bravely floated through the Gump, although wind tunnels do awful things to the stuff that ghosts are made of, and brought the dreadful news to the sailors waiting in the cove. Since then, for 9 long years, Ernie and the other station ghosts had kept watch on the Trottles' house, and now they waited to welcome the rescuers and show them the way. "Are you going to say anything?" asked Mrs. Partridge, "about, Raymond?" She was an older ghost than Ernie and remembered the war and how friendly everyone had been, with the soldiers crowding the station and always ready for a chat. Being a spectre suited her. Her legs had been dreadful when she was alive, all swollen and sore from scrubbing floors all day, and she never got over feeling as free and light as air. Ernie shook his head. "Don't think so," he said. "No point in upsetting them. They'll find out soon enough." Mrs. Partridge nodded. She never believed in making trouble, and a very pale, frail ghost called Miriam Hughes agreed. She'd been an apologising lady, one of those people whose voices came over the loudspeaker all day saying "sorry" to travellers because their trains are late. No one can do that for quite long and stay healthy, and she had died quite young of sadness and pneumonia. They were a close band, the spectres who haunted platform 13. The ghosts of the Gump, they called themselves, and they didn't have much truck with outside. There was the ghost of a train spotter called Brian, who'd got between the buffers and the 9:15 from Peterborough, and the ghost of the old woman who'd lost her umbrella and still hovered over the left luggage office, keeping an eye on it. And there were others hauntingly shy in various parts of the station, not wanting to put themselves forward, but ready to lend a hand if they were needed. The hands of the great clock moved slowly forward. Not the clock on platform 13, which were covered in cobwebs, but that of the main one. 11:30, 11:45, midnight. And then it happened. The wall of the gentleman's cloakroom moved slowly, slowly to one side. A hole appeared, a deep, dark hole, and from it came swirls of mist and, very faintly, the smell of the sea. Mrs. Partridge clutched Ernie's arm. "Oh, I am excited," she whispered. And indeed it was exciting. It was awesome. The dark hole, the swirling mist, and now, in the hole, there appeared figures. 3 of them, and hovering high above them, a clear blue eye. "Welcome," said Ernie Hobbs. He bowed, and the woman curtsied, and the rescuers stepped forward into the light. It has to be said that the ghosts were surprised. They knew that the prince was to be brought back without a fuss, but they had expected, something a bit fiercer. Of course, they could see that the ancient gentleman now tottering towards them was a wizard. His face was very wise, and there seemed to be astrological signs in his long dark cloak, though when they looked more carefully, they saw they were pieces of very old spaghetti and tomato sauce. The wizard's ear trumpet, which he wore on a string around his neck, had tangled with the cord holding his spectacles, so that it looked as if he might choke to death before he even set out on his mission. And though they could see a place on his shoulder where a mighty eagle must have once perched, it was definitely not there any more. Yet, when he came forward to shake hands with them, the ghosts were impressed. How you shake hands with a ghost matters, because of course you feel nothing, and someone who isn't a true gentleman can just wave his hands about in mid-air and make a ghost feel really small. "I am Cornelius the Mighty," said Cor, "and I bring thanks from their majesties for your guardianship of the Gump." He then introduced Gerkentrude. The Fae was wearing a large hat decorated with flowers, but also with a single beetroot. It was a living beetroot. Gerkie would never have worn anything that was dead, and she carried a straw basket full of important things for gardening, a watering can, some brown paper bags, a roll of twine. The ghost knew all about these healing ladies who go about making things better for everyone, and they'd seen fairy godmothers in the pantomime, but Mrs. Partridge was a bit worried about the hat. The beetroot suited Gerkie. It went with her kind pink face, but of course vegetables are not worn very much in London. But it was the third person who puzzled the ghosts of the Gump particularly. Why had the rulers of the island sent a little girl? Odge's thick black hair had been yanked into 2 pigtails, and she wore a pleated gym slip and a blazer with "Play up and play the game" embroidered on the pocket. The uniform was an exact copy of the one of the girls of St. Agnes's wore in the photograph that Gerkie's mother had had on her mantelpiece, but the ghost did not know that, nor did they understand why the suitcase she was clutching, holding it out in front of her like a tea tray, was punched full of holes. Fortunately, the eye at least belonged to the kind of rescuer they had expected, because they themselves were often invisible. The ghosts could make out the shape of the ogre, even though he was covered in fernseed. They could see his enormous muscles, each the size of a young sheep, and his sledgehammer fists, and while the embroidered braces were a pity, they thought that he would do very well as a bodyguard. Cornelius now explained that they were disguised as an ordinary human family. "I am a retired university professor. Gerkentrude is my niece who works for the Ministry of Agriculture, and Odge is her goddaughter on the way to boarding school." As for the ogre, he told them, he would stay invisible, closing his eye when necessary, but not, it was hoped, bumping into things. "And the dear boy?" Gerkentrude now asked eagerly. "Dear little Raymond, is he well?" There was a pause, while Early and Mrs. Partridge looked at each other, and the ghost of the apologising lady stared at the ground. "He's very well," said Ernie. "In the pink," put in Mrs. Partridge. "And knows nothing?" "Nothing," agreed Ernie. It now struck the rescuers that there was very little bustle around the gentleman's cloakroom, and that this was unusual. Last time the Gump had opened, there had been a stream of people going down. Tree spirits whose trees had got Dutch elm disease, water nymphs whose ponds had dried up, and just ordinary people who were fed up with the pollution and the noise. But when they pointed this out to Ernie, he said, "Maybe they'll come later. There's 9 days to go." Actually, he didn't think they'd come later. He didn't think they'd come at all, and he knew why. "Let us plunge into the bowels of the earth," said Cornelius, who wanted to be on his way. But the underground had stopped running, and so had the buses. "And I wouldn't advise waking Raymond Trottle in the middle of the night," said Ernie. "I wouldn't advise that at all." So it was decided they would walk to Trottle Towers and rest in the park till morning. There was a little summer house hidden in the bushes and close to Raymond's back door where nobody would find them. The only problem was the wizard, who was too tottery to go far, and the giant solved that by saying, "I pig him on back." This seemed a good idea. Of course, they'd have to watch out for people who'd be surprised to see an old gentleman having a piggyback in mid-air, but as the ghosts were coming along to show them the way, that wouldn't be difficult. Odge had gone back into the cloakroom to do something to her suitcase. They could hear a tap running and her voice talking to someone. Now, as she stomped after the others down the platform, Ernie took a closer look at her. At the unequal eyes, the fierce black eyebrows which met in the middle, at a glimmer of blue as she yawned. Ah, not just a little girl then, a hag. Well, they could do with one of those with what was coming to them, thought Ernie Hobbs. "Goodness, isn't it grand?" said Gerkentrude, looking at the house, which was as famous on the island as Buckingham Palace, or the castle where King Arthur had lived with his knights. Gerkie was right. Trottle Towers was very grand. It had 3 stories and bristled with curly bits of plasterwork and bow windows and turrets in the roof. The front of the house was separated from the street by a stony garden with gravel paths and a high spiked gate. On the railings were notices saying, "Tradesmen not admitted," and "It is strictly forbidden to park." And on the brickwork of the house were 3 burglar alarms like yellow boils. The back of the house faced the park, and it was from here that the rescuers had come. The ghost had returned to the Gump. Dawn was just breaking, but inside the house everything was silent and dark. Then, as they stood and looked, a light came on downstairs, deep in the basement. The room had barred windows and almost no furniture, so that they could see who was inside as clearly as on a stage. A boy. So there's the boy, look. I think it's Raymond. Could be. A boy with light hair and a friendly, intelligent face. He was dressed in jeans and a sweater, and he was working. On a low table stood a row of shoes of all shapes and sizes, boots and ladies' high-heeled sandals and gentlemen's lace-ups, and the boy was cleaning them. Not just rubbing a cloth over them, but working in the polish with a will, and as he worked, he whistled. They could just hear him through the open slit at the top of the window. And the rescuers turned to each other and smiled, for they could see that the prince had been taught to work, that he wasn't being brought up spoilt and selfish as they had feared. Something about the way the ghosts had spoken about Raymond Trottle had worried them, but the boy's alert face, the willing way in which he'd polished other people's shoes, was a sign of the best possible breeding. This was a prince who would know how to serve others, as did his parents. The boy finished the shoes and carried them out. A second light went on, and they saw him enter a scullery, fill a kettle and lay out some cups and saucers on a tray. This job, too, he did neatly and nimbly, and Odge sighed, for it was amazing how right she had been about the prince. He was just the kind of person she wanted for a friend, and she held on even tighter to the suitcase, glad that she had brought in the present that any boy could have. The scullery light went off, and a light appeared between the crack in a pair of curtains which the boy now drew back. As he did this, they could see his face turn towards them, the straight light lapping the level brows, the wide-set eyes and the pointed chin. Then he made his way to the bed and set the tray down beside a fierce-looking lady who didn't seem to be thanking him at all, but just grabbed her cup. "That must be Mrs. Trottle," whispered Gertrude. "She doesn't look very loving." The boy's tasks were still not done. Back in the scullery, he took out a mop and bucket and began to wipe the floor. Was he perhaps working a little too hard for a child who'd not yet had breakfast? Or was he on a training scheme? Knights often live like this before a joust or a tournament, and Boy Scouts too. But nothing mattered except that the prince was everything a boy should be, and that the day they brought him back to his rightful home would be the most joyful one the island had ever known. "Can't we go and tell him we're here?" asked Dodge. There was no need. The boy had come out of the back door carrying a polythene bag full of rubbish, which he'd put in the dustbin. Then he lifted his head and saw them. For a moment he stood perfectly still with a look of wonder on his face, and it was almost as though he was listening to some distant remembered music. Then he lightly ran up the basement steps and threw open the gate. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Is there anyone you want to see?" Cor the wizard stepped forward. He wanted to greet the prince by his true name, to bow his head before him, but he knew he must not startle him, and trying to speak in an ordinary voice, though he was very much moved, he said, "Yes, there is someone we want to see you. You." The boy drew in his breath. He looked at Gerkie's round, kind face, at the grassy patch on the wizard's head, at Odge, who had turned shy and was scuffing her shoes. Then he sighed, as though a weight had fallen from him, and said, "You mean it? It's really me you've come to see?" "Indeed it is, my dear," said Gertrude, and put her arm around him. He was too thin, and why hadn't Mrs. Trottle cut his hair? It was bothering him, flopping over his eyes. The boy's next words surprised them. "I wish I could ask you in, but I'm not allowed to have visitors," he said, and they could see how much he minded not being able to invite them into his house. "But there's a bench there under the oak tree where you could rest, and I could get you a drink. No one's up yet, they wouldn't notice." "We need nothing," said Cor, "but let us be seated, we have much to tell you." They made their way back into the park, and the boy took out his handkerchief and wiped the wooden slats of the seat clear of leaves. It was though he was inviting them to his bench, even if he couldn't invite them to his house. Nor would he sit himself down, but stood before them and answered their questions in a steady voice. "You have lived all your life in Trottle Towers?" asked Cor. "Yes." A shadow spread for a moment over his face, as though he was looking back on a childhood that had been far from happy. "And you've learnt to work, we can see that. But you're schooling?" "Oh yes, I go to school. It's across the park in a different part of London." Very different, he thought. Swale Bottle Junior was in a rowdy, shabby street. The building was full of cracks and the teachers were often tired, but it was a good place to be. It was the holidays he minded, not the term. The ogre had managed to follow them to the bench with his eyes shut, but the prince's voice pleased him so much that he now opened it. Cor frowned at him. Gertie shook her head. They had been so careful not to startle the prince, and invisible ogres are unusual. There is nothing to be done about that. But the boy didn't seem at all put out by a single blue eye floating halfway up the trunk of the tree. "Is he or she, I don't want to pry, but is he a friend of yours?" Hans was introduced, and the visitors made up their minds. The prince was entirely untroubled by magic. It was though the traditions of the island were in his blood, even if he hadn't been there since he was 3 months old. It was time to reveal themselves and take him back. "Was that Mrs. Trottle, to whom you brought a cup of tea?" asked Cor, "because we have something to say to her." The boy smiled. "Oh, goodness, no," he said. "Mrs. Trottle lives upstairs. That was the cook." Cor frowned. He was an old-fashioned man and a bit of a snob, and he did not think it absolutely right that a prince should have to take morning tea to the cook. But Odge had had enough of talking. "I've brought you something," she said in her abrupt, throaty little voice. "A present, something nice." She put the suitcase down on the grass. The words Odge Gribble, hag, had been painted out. Instead, she'd written, "This way up, handle with care." The boy crouched down beside her. He could hear the present breathing through the holes. Something alive, he thought, his eyes alight. It was at that moment, on the first floor of Trottle Towers, someone began to scream. All of them were used to the sound of screaming. Odge's sisters practically never stopped. Banshees wailed through the trees of the island. Harpies yowled, and the sound of bull seals calling to their mates sometimes seemed to shake the rafters. But this was not that sort of a scream. It was not the healthy scream of someone going about their business. It was a whining, self-pitying, blackmailing sort of scream. Odge refastened the catch of her suitcase in a hurry. Gertrude put her arm around the prince, and the eye soared upwards as Hans got to his feet. "What is it, dear boy?" asked Gertie, and put her free hand up to her head as though to protect the beetroot from the dreadful noise. "Is it someone having an operation?" said Cornelius. "I thought you had anaesthetics." The boy shook his head. "No," he said, "it's nothing like that. It's Raymond." A terrible silence fell. "What do you mean it's Raymond?" asked Cor, when he could speak again. "Surely you are Raymond Trottle, the supposed son of Mr. and Mrs. Trottle." The boy shook his head once more. "No, oh goodness, no. I'm only the kitchen boy. I'm not anybody. My name's Ben." As he spoke, Ben moved away and stood with his back to the visitors. It was over then. It wasn't him they'd come to see. He'd been an idiot. When he'd seen them standing there, he'd such a feeling of homecoming, as though at last the years of drudgery were over. It was like that dream the dream with the sea in it, and soft green turf, and someone whose face he couldn't see clearly, but who he knew he wanted him. Only dreams were things you woke from, and he should have known that it was not for him, but Raymond the visitors had come to find. Everything had always belonged to Raymond. All his life he'd been used to Raymond living upstairs with everything he wished for and parents to dote on him. Raymond had cupboards full of toys he'd even looked at and more clothes than he knew what to do with. He was driven to his posh school in a Rolls Royce, and just to tear the wrapping paper from his Christmas presents took Raymond hours. And so far, Ben hadn't minded. He was used to living with the servants, used to living in a windowless cupboard and working for his keep. You couldn't envy Raymond, who was always whining and saying, "I'm bored." But this was different. That these strange and mysterious, interesting people belonged to Raymond and not to him was almost more than he could bear. "You're sure he isn't being tortured?" asked Cor, as the screams went on. "Quite sure. He often does that." "Often?" said the wizard, and shook out his ear trumpet in case he'd misheard. Ben nodded. "Whenever he doesn't want to go to school. Probably he hasn't done his homework. I usually do it for him, but I couldn't yesterday because I was visiting my grandmother in hospital." "Who is your grandmother?" Odge wanted to know. "She's called Nanny Brown. She used to be Mrs. Trottle's nanny, and she still lives here in the basement. She adopted me when I was a baby because I didn't have any parents." "What happened to them?" Ben shrugged. "I don't know. They died. Mr. Fulton thinks they must have been in prison because Nanny never mentions them." Talking about Nanny Brown was difficult because she was very ill. It was she who protected him from the bullying of the servants. Even the snooty butler, Mr. Fulton, respected her, and if she died... The rescuers were silent, huddled together on the bench. Hans had closed his eye and was covering his face with his invisible hand. He was used to the silence of the mountains and felt a headache coming on. Odge was crouched over the suitcase as though to comfort what was inside. It was a child who was making that noise. The child they had come so far to find, and the boy they liked so much had nothing to do with them at all. Oh, and there's Odge, look, over the suitcase. What do you think she's got in there then? It's something alive, isn't it? Something special? Oh, and then there's chapter 5. So that's the end of chapter 4 then. Right, well, I hope you're enjoying it so far. Such a shame that Ben isn't the prince, isn't it? And instead it sounds like Raymond's not a very nice boy. Oh dear. Right, I'll see you next time. Bye.